Hi there everyone, this is another episode of my Canadian records, and I should say up front that I keep on talking too long in some of these videos, so if I talk too long just tell me to shut up in the comments or something. But I'm going to spread this seas out over about 3 or 4 videos. The first one I did went to about 15 minutes. I said to myself, people shouldn't have to listen to me for that long, so I'm going to keep this down under 10 if I can. First album is Simon Kane. It's one album they had. They're from Toronto, 1970. On RCA, it's LSP 4410, so I assume it was released in the United States too, but I don't know that for a fact. But this is a sketch of the singer Simon Kane. Simon Kane wasn't his real name, it was just the name stage name, I guess. It's an interesting album though. It's a rock album, just a typical rock album of its day. Dennis Pendrith, the bass player, went on to play with Bruce Cockburn. Some good musicians on this album. It was produced and engineered by George Semku, recorded at RCA Studios in Toronto, one of the great recording studios in Toronto, and unfortunately I don't think it's there anymore. The liner notes were by Richie York, and Richie York was the Canadian correspondent at the time for Billboard magazine. And I've shown you in a previous video, Richie York wrote what I think to be the first Led Zeppelin biography, and to this day he's still a friend of, I think, of the members of Led Zeppelin. I know he's a friend of Jason Bonham because my brother knows Richie York, and he got my brother tickets for the Jason Bonham concert in Toronto about a year ago. Something else that's interesting about this album. It was one of the first projects by Bob Ezrin. Not that Bob Ezrin produced this album, but Bob Ezrin and Gary Muth, who were kind of partners at the time. Bob was about 20, I think, years old, 20 or 21 years old, and he and Gary Muth were managing Simon Kane at the time. And, Bob certainly went on to greater success as a producer, and Gary Muth is a music industry veteran here in Canada. John Allen Cameron, The Minstrel of Cranberry Lane. This is on Apex Records out of Quebec. It was released in the 1960s. It's a very early album by John Allen Cameron, possibly his first album. And he was a folk singer from the Maritimes, I believe, possibly Nova Scotia. He was very popular here in Canada, used to be on the CBC quite often, and he recorded later albums on Columbia Records or CBS here in Canada. He passed away a few years ago, I think. He was a very popular guy. I've shown this before. It is a band called Cano, Au Nord de Notre Vie, and they were from Sudbury, Ontario, a musical collective, and they recorded in both French and English. The cover on this, I'll just close up a bit, it's a modernistic depiction of the scenery, possibly around Sudbury. It's stone outcroppings, trees, water. It's very pretty up there, as Jen Zeppelin will attest. Here's the members of the band on the back cover. Another of their albums, and they did record several albums. This one's from 1979. It's called Rendezvous. What's interesting about this album is the fact that it was produced by Jim Vallance. If that name's familiar, he worked a lot with Bryan Adams. I think he co-wrote a lot of Bryan Adams' hits and produced with Bryan Adams. Bryan sings backup on a couple songs on this album, and it was before he became famous in the 1980s. Toronto band called Chalk Circle. It's called The Great Lake. This is from the late 80s. As is another Chalk Circle album. This is called Mending Wall. This is an interesting recording. It's by a Canadian band called Chimo, who recorded just one album, 1970 as well. And Chimo, you'll notice in Canada a lot of names, bands, whatever, are named after First Nations or native peoples or language. And Chimo apparently means hello in Inuit, which is Eskimos. It's ice. Chimo and Ice there on the cover. This was on Epic Records, and it's assigned a normal Epic number, 30329, so I assume it was released in the States, although I don't know that. Now the lead singer of Chimo, Breen LeBeouf, he later went on to form a band called Offenbach, was a member of Offenbach, who recorded in French. I don't have any of their albums. I think they recorded out of Quebec, and they had several albums. I do remember them. He also later on joined Celine Dion's backing band, and was also a member, and might still be a member, of April Wine. This album is by a band, it's called Heritage. It's the first album by a band called Christmas. Now Christmas, I'll show you the other side of this. Folds out. There they are on top of a tank. And it's on Daffodil Records. This is the second album, I believe, that was released on Daffodil Records here in Canada. It's highly collectible, very kind of rare. Christmas had 3 albums, and I think the third one was called The Spirit of Christmas. But the guitar player, Bob Bryden, who was here in the picture, I mean, he was a customer of mine back in the 70s when I used to work in record stores in Oshawa, Ontario. Bob was also a member of this album that I showed you earlier this summer, Rain Ghost, which is one of the great psychedelic collectible albums. So if he was 1970, if he was 19 years old, in this album here, and there's Bob, he was probably about 17 or 18 years old. David Clayton Thomas, Linda Ronstadt and the Stone Ponies. David Clayton Thomas on one side and Linda Ronstadt on the other side. And I don't normally recommend Pickwick albums, but this one has kind of a nice psychedelic cover to it. And what's cool about this is it was released after David Clayton Thomas was a member of Blood, Sweat and Tears. But there are 5 tracks on the first side of his recordings from the mid-60s. One of the tracks is Brainwashed. Now, Brainwashed, if you don't know the song, download it or something. It's one of the great punk rock records of all time. Just a fantastic record, and not typical of the rest of his material, but it's just a great record. The Linda Ronstadt's side is material from her days in the Stone Ponies, and it includes different drum. And I think that's the tune that was written by Mike Nesmith. David Clayton Thomas, his first solo album of the 1970s. I don't know if he was still a member of Blood, Sweat and Tears when he recorded this, but this came from radio station CKXM. I think that radio station is on Vancouver Island. This album was recorded all over the place. There are some tracks recorded in Memphis with Steve Cropper. There's some tracks from Los Angeles, and some tracks from New York City. And the last record I'll show you is another David Clayton Thomas solo album. It's called Clayton. It's recorded in 1978 and recorded in Toronto, although they brought in Randy, the Brecker brothers, and Dave Sanborn to play on this album. It was produced by Jack Richardson, Nimbus 9 Productions. Jack Richardson, the late Jack Richardson, one of the great producers. He recorded the Guess Who and Poco and a whole bunch of people. Thank you for watching, everyone.